Well, gang, here we are, and I am today replacing the one and only Paul Tranny because he's having the day off, as he very much deserves because he works hard, and I want that man to take a little time to breathe. So, we're going to do a masterclass today focused on Photoshop brushes, which is something I happen to know a little bit about. And what I wanted to do today was talk to you all about several basic things, but then I want to get into some of the nitty-gritty. There are plenty of tutorials you could find on YouTube or elsewhere that explain really the ins and outs of how a brush is made. I'll cover some of that basic ground, but I do want to go into some things that a lot of people maybe have never discovered before, such as the importance and usefulness and the power of things like color dynamics and mixer brushes and some of the other brush modes we could talk about as well. So let's dive right in and get to it. All right, so thanks again for joining me today. I'm excited to do this. This is something I love to talk about a lot, as many of you probably know. I want to check in really quickly with the chat, make sure everyone's doing okay today. We see Michelle. Hi, Michelle. Hi, Yasunari. Hi, Steve. Nice to see you, Monica, Cindy, and Tunk, and Jane. Hey, all right, we are ready to get going. All right, so let's do this. So to kick things off, I want to start first explaining what a Photoshop brush is exactly. We call them brushes, but actually what's happening when you draw with a brush might be a mystery to you, and you might be wondering what exactly is happening with behind the scenes when I'm drawing. So if I were to just go and open up one of the general most basic brushes of all in Photoshop, such as the hard round brush in the general brushes category, and then start drawing with it, all right, what's actually happening is, I want to show you something here. I'm going to open up the brush settings panel, and we're going to talk a lot about this panel during this session because it's one of those things that people look at and it's overwhelming. They see a bunch of words that don't necessarily mean anything to them. They see a bunch of shapes. They see sliders and doodads and whistles and bells. And you know what? Most people say, okay, I don't even want to bother with that. I'll just try and find some brushes I like and paint and draw with them. But let's take a little look under the hood, so to speak, and see what's actually happening here. So now this is the most basic of brushes you could ever build if you wanted to build one. And the way brushes work is the very first ingredient you need to make a custom brush, to make any Photoshop brush, is a stamp. And what I mean by that is simply a graphic, okay, an image of any kind. And in Photoshop, these images are grayscale images. They are not RGB images. And what we're dealing with here with this brush is a simple circle. Now, when I tap with this circle, and you'll notice that the color for my foreground here is actually black, right? So if I were to show you my color picker for a moment, okay, the color I have is black. But you look at this brush and you notice that by me simply tapping once, I'm not even using my stylus, I'm just tapping with the mouse, bam. I'm not getting a full black circle. And the reason for this is because the flow of the brush, the flow setting, is not set to 100%. So one of the other things we have to understand about working with brushes in Photoshop is the many settings that come along with them that you can change on the fly that change the behaviors of those brushes as you're using them. Now, coming straight out of the box, this brush is going to look like this. Bam, black circle, okay? Now if you look up here, I adjusted the flow to 100%. I want you to think about flow in a very different way from opacity. People get these confused sometimes. What flow is essentially the rate at which the pigment that you're using, if you could think of it in natural media terms, the rate at which it is flowing out of the stylus. So if there were a low flow, imagine that as you're drawing, only some of the medium that you're using, whether it's charcoal or pencil or crayon or watercolor or oils, whatever it happens to be, is flowing very slowly down onto the page, which means you're not depositing very much of it at the time that you're using it, okay, in one single stroke. However, if you increase that flow up to 100%, which is its maximum value, then what's actually happening is that medium, that color, is rushing out of the brush at full speed, and so you're going to get 100% opaque marks. Now, we're going to get into this a little later, but you can actually control flow with your stylus, okay? And that's with the pressure that you're using. You can also control it with other things such as tilt. We'll talk about all those when we get to the brush settings for shape dynamics, for scattering and texture and all these things. But just to stay with the basics, when I do this and I make a circle on the page, okay, what you're seeing is the shape that is that this brush is comprised of. However, when I do this, what's happening is I'm taking that shape and I'm telling Photoshop to stamp it on the canvas in quick succession. And every time that I stamp it, okay, that same circle is being deposited 1 pixel or so next to, 1 pixel over in the direction that I'm moving my stylus. And what you get is the illusion of a line, like you're drawing a line. But that's not actually what you're getting. You're just getting the stamp, and it's being repeatedly stamped along a path that you draw to create this illusion of a line. It's important to understand this because it's going to explain for you much better what is happening when you make custom brushes and why they have the appearance and the behavior that they have when you understand this very basic principle. Now, I'll just clear this away for a moment, and I want to show you something. Here, when we open the brush settings, the very first thing I want you to look at is up here we have brush tip shape. Okay, I'm not going to fiddle with any of these other settings for the moment. I just want you to look at this brush tip shape, and to the right you're going to have a library of shapes. Okay, these are all the many shapes that I currently have loaded into Photoshop. Now, if you look down here, okay, we have the size slider. You can adjust the diameter of that brush. Okay, that's very easy to understand. But here comes a very important thing that people don't always pay attention to, and that is spacing. Now, as I've just explained what's happening when you draw with a brush, I want you to notice that the spacing here says 5%. Without getting too technical, and you don't have to deal with thinking about this in terms of math and all that, but I do want to explain that what it's telling me is that whatever the diameter of the brush is, let's say that diameter is 100 pixels. If I tell Photoshop I want the spacing for this brush to be 5%, I'm telling it that I want every successive stamp that is being applied to the canvas as I draw along a path to be stamped at a distance of 5% of the total width or diameter of that brush. Okay, so right now, because 5% is a mere 5 pixels of the size being, if it were 100, I'll just make it 100 right here. Okay, so every 5 pixels, it's going to stick another circle there. All right, now because that's such a tiny distance, we're still getting the illusion of a line. Watch what happens when I increase the spacing. Okay, down here, I'll just pull that slider over. Now we're exposing the workings of the brush. Now we're really seeing how Photoshop is doing this. All right, if I expose, can somebody help me with my language, please? I haven't had enough coffee today. If I go down to 100%, okay, what that means is every 100 pixels, since that's the full diameter of the brush, I'm going to make a new stamp. And so what you get is, if I were to zoom in here, you get these circles touching each other at a 1 pixel distance, okay? So now we understand what's happening when we're drawing with a brush, okay? Instead of seeing this, we're seeing something like this because those stamps are so close to one another. This also explains why sometimes you get lag with a brush. Imagine you have a very large brush stamp, so it's a big graphic, and maybe it's got some changes in opacity, all right? You apply a texture to that brush, and then you apply all kinds of other settings like color dynamics and scattering. Basically, Photoshop is having to compute and understand that brush with every single stamp that you're making, and if it's in a really tight space, then the processing power that's required to make that line and make all the behaviors look correct is pretty intense, right? So that's explaining why you sometimes get lag. We can talk about ways to reduce lag. And the very first thing I would mention to you is if you do have a brush that's relatively complex and you're getting lag with it, go ahead and try and bump the spacing up a little bit and see how much you can bump it up to where you still get a decent looking line, but you're increasing the speed at which you're able to draw. So that would be my first expert tip there, okay? All right, so now we understand the basics. So how do you make a brush look interesting? How do you make a custom brush do some cool stuff? Well, let's start with the most important ingredient, which is the stamp, all right? So the circle is fine, right? And there are lots of things I can do with a circle. For example, let's dive into shape dynamics. Now I'm going to open up the shape dynamics panel. And there's a confusing thing about this for people, which is that the very first category you have here is size jitter. It makes people think that they're going to, by adjusting size jitter, they're going to create some kind of a random behavior. So really what this should be called is size as a category. And then underneath it, there should be subheaders for size jitter and some other things, okay? But that's just not the way it is, so that can be confusing. I want to show you here where it says control, what this means. Now I'm using a Wacom stylus. I'm drawing on a Cintiq 22HD. It's still my favorite model they ever made, although all of the latest ones they've made are great. But I still love to use this one. It's a little older than some. And I can choose to select pen pressure to control the size. Look at my brush stamp preview down here. All right, let me just turn that off for a moment. Here's the brush behaving as normal. All right, the moment I assign pen pressure to control it, look what happens to my brush stamp preview. It's showing me that I now have a range, right, between thick to thin for the line that I draw. And I'm telling it that I want to control that with pen pressure. So with lighter pressure, I'm going to get a thinner line, and with heavier pressure, it's going to get fatter, and then so on, okay? And the reason for that is I'm setting the minimum diameter of the brush down to 0, which means I want it to go all the way down to 1 pixel, okay? And that's going to change as I slide this around. So if the minimum is half of the total diameter, then of course the smallest mark I can make would be 50 pixels, and the largest will still be 100, all right? So now we're getting into some of the things you can do with even just a simple brush like a round brush to make an interesting stroke. Why don't we take it a step further? Let's go back out to our brush tip shape where we started. I'm going to increase the spacing a little bit. And by increasing it a little, see I'm getting a bumpier line? Well, that's because now what's happening is, as I'm drawing, that stamp is getting spaced farther apart from each stamp that came before it. Let's take it another step further and look at size jitter. Now, size jitter is a real thing, and what it means is that by increasing the value here, I'm going to tell Photoshop that I'm going to increase it all the way up to 30%. I want there to be a 30% variation, range of variations that I can apply to this stamp in terms of how big the size is, inside the range that I already assigned for the minimum and maximum diameter. Well, since I have a full range here for my diameter from 0% to 100, if you see right here, right, then 30% of that, there can be a 30% shift in the size that I'm drawing with as I drag. Now look, what that does, again, changes the qualities of that stroke so that now we have even more variation in the stroke. All right. Now, I'm not going to talk about angle jitter because we have to use a brush that isn't a perfect circle to make that work, but I am going to talk about roundness jitter just below it. This is one that a lot of people don't experiment with, and there's a lot of power to be taken from this setting. Now with roundness jitter, what you're actually telling Photoshop is that because you have a perfect circle for the stamp, let come out here, you can look at this, this little preview here is showing us that we now have currently the roundness setting for this stamp at 100. But if I tap on one of these circles here and drag, I can create more of an oval. See that? I can pinch it down like that. Now that automatically is going to change the quality of the brush as well. Now I'm drawing with an oval. And if I increase the spacing, you'll see what's happening behind the scenes, right? This is what's happening as I draw. So I'm getting the size jitter, I'm getting the variation in the size based on the pressure that I'm using with my stylus, right? And I'm also basically distorting that original brush shape by turning it into an oval, by squishing it from the top and the bottom. But let me show you something interesting. If we come back to the shape dynamics here, under roundness jitter, you probably figured out by now, understanding what jitter is, which is that variation, right? That random variation that you're adding. I could increase the roundness jitter for the brush in the same way that I do with the diameter. So what I'm going to do is assign this to pen pressure for a moment, okay? And I'm going to do my minimum roundness all the way down to 1. Now what this is going to do is with very, very, very light pressure, it's going to take that perfect circle that I would normally be drawing with and squish it down to an oval that is only 1 pixel high. Okay, it's essentially doing this. If I were to take this here, it's squishing it down to this, a roundness of 0%, which is a single pixel, okay, in height stamp. So now look what that does as I draw. Okay, now why is this useful? Well, for inking, people take advantage of this to give themselves far more control and a much snappier line on the thinner strokes by cheating Photoshop basically into taking their stamp and squishing it down. With tight spacing, if I bring my spacing down to something like 5%, okay, and I'll do my minimum at about 20% here, I'll be able to get a much broader range of strokes. And look how nice and fine these lines can be and snappy when I draw with them. And I've still got all that jitter going on. If I were to reduce that jitter and even get my spacing tighter down to like 2%, bring the minimum roundness down to about 15, now I'm getting these really fine lines with light pressure because I'm squishing that stamp into an oval. But there are other applications for this as well. Now, we didn't talk about jitter. Jitter is that random value that you can have popping in and out. If I increase that to say 50%, look what happens to my line, similar to size jitter, okay? I'll actually make my brush stamp a little smaller and I'll angle it slightly. Look, I'm going to take this and angle it slightly, right? Completely different kind of a line. So for those people who like to ink in Photoshop, all I've done is taken the basic round brush and I've applied a few things to it here, and now the quality of the line I'm drawing with is quite different from where we started just by making these several adjustments. So this is the tip of the iceberg. All right, now scattering. Let's move on to that and just briefly touch on what this does. Scattering is going to take your stamp, and imagine I'm drawing a path in this direction. Well, if I tell it to scatter, let me just increase the spacing so you can see what happens here. Okay, and I'll turn off some of these other things so it's not too much going on. There we go. Alrighty. Now, normally you can see what's happening. The stamp will follow the path that I draw along a perfect line, right? So if I draw to the left, it will follow. If I draw up, it will follow. No matter what I do, it's going to follow along. However, with scattering, what I can do is say, look, here's the path I want to draw, all right? But I'd like for the stamp occasionally to jump off of that path, either to the left or to the right, all right? So I'm just going to do this. Now look at my brush stamp preview down at the bottom right here. And watch what happens as I increase the scatter, see? So now if I draw the same line as before, even though this is the direction I'm moving my stylus, right? With scattering on, it's going to take those individual stamps and it's going to shift them off that path by a few pixels, right? Now, of course, you can go nuts with this. So I can increase it up to like 490%, and it's just going to push those much farther away from the path where I'm drawing. Well, you can start to imagine why this would be useful for certain kinds of custom brushes like spatter, for example. And there are other applications for it as well, which I'll show you, but this is a very powerful thing. Not only can you increase the distance, okay, that the stamp is moving away from the path that you're drawing, but you can also increase the instances of that stamp, the number of times that stamp is applied in a single pass. So instead of doing one stamp followed by another stamp, followed by another stamp as you're drawing, you can actually tell Photoshop, I want 2 stamps applied in that one pass, not one. So 2 stamps, 2 stamps, 2 stamps, and I want those stamps to be in different locations from one another, still following along that path. Look at my brush stamp preview here, all right, down here at the bottom. As I go from 1 instance of the stamp to 2, I'm increasing the count. See, 1 to 2, and then to 3. So now when I draw with this brush, this is what I'm getting. So you can imagine if I decrease the spacing a little bit, okay, and come back to my scattering and increase to about 4, a count of 4. Now I'm getting a much more textured kind of a line, right? But what's really happening is I'm creating that random textured line with 4 different instances of the same stamp being applied every single time. All right? And that's what's creating that variation. So if you're looking for a way to create lines that are not repetitive in any way, where there's no evidence of the stamp being really obvious and feeling like it's just repeating itself one image at a time, this is one of the tricks you can use to do that. Especially good for any kind of natural media emulation, such as charcoal or chalk, crayon. Good for lettering artists who don't want to expose that stamp that they're using, but do want some variation in the line that they're working with. Okay, I'm going to check the chat here for a moment. I just want to see if we have any questions, because I know I'm covering a lot of ground here as quickly as I can. All right, let's see. Great. I'm glad you're enjoying this, Jessica. Yeah, basic stuff is important to know. We'll jump into some complex stuff here in a minute. Let's see here. General round brush. Yes, that's what I'm using at the moment. Nothing fancy just yet. This is not the mouse, Steve. I'm using a Wacom Cintiq 22 HD. Let's see here. Good effects. Thank you, Yasunari. Yes, you can change basic settings for pressure at the driver level with a Wacom Cintiq. So you open that in your system preferences and then adjust from there. Yeah, the Kirby brush. That's Keith. Thanks for mentioning that. That is one of the brushes that I made, and this is how I did it. Was using a different count, okay, and a bigger scatter. And this brings us to our next topic, which is controlling the scatter. Sometimes you don't want it to be totally random. Well, look, you can control the scatter with pen pressure. Amazing. So with very light pressure, look at this, nothing. Now look what happens as I use heavier pressure and then back to light pressure. All right, so we'll reduce the count, increase the scatter, increase the spacing slightly, and look what this does. So now I can do a line like this, increase the pressure, and then decrease the pressure, all with the same brush. So of course, this is very powerful, and there's just a ton you could do with this. All right. Now, we're still just working with this very simple, basic round brush. All right. I'm going to turn off the scattering for a moment. Come back to our basic line. I'll turn off the size jitter. And now we're just going to decrease that spacing so we have, again, a pretty standard basic brush to draw with. All right, nothing too fancy. We do have shape dynamics turned on for pen pressure to control the diameter of the brush. Alrighty, next, I want to show you some texture. All right, now Photoshop does come with some basic textures built in, and these are some of them here. I have some of my own here. I actually have a vast library of about 800 or 900 textures, maybe more. Much more than anybody needs, but I had to create those to create all the custom brushes that I made for the Adobe Brush Library. I just got a brand new laptop, so what you're seeing here is really just nothing apart from 1 or 2 textures that I've made in the past few weeks. But I want to just take one of those textures and show you how textures work when you apply them to a brush. So this one right here is a grainy texture. Now, by simply taking the brush and saying, look, I want to apply a texture to it, all right, nothing's going to happen. You have to decide how you want that texture interact with the brush, all right? So what I'll show you is this here. The very first one and the most useful one that I find is using height. Now, I want you to imagine it this way. The texture is a grayscale image, all right? And the areas that are pushing towards black are going to be like the areas of a piece of canvas, okay, that are raised, the bumpy bits, all right? And the areas that are white are the areas that are moving down towards the flat surface that the bumps are sitting on. So it's like receding away from you. So whatever is coming up, pushing upwards and making contact with your stylus, those are the darker areas of the grayscale image, and the areas that are lighter are the ones that are going to be pushed away from you. Now, this means you can create very realistic textured effects with your brushes by imagining that, for example, if I were painting on canvas and used very light pressure, what would happen? Well, the paint would be applied to the bumpy raised areas of the canvas, right? Or if I was drawing on some very toothy paper and using charcoal, then the charcoal would be deposited on the toothy bumpy areas, and then the receding areas, the areas that are recessed, okay, would not be picking up all that medium, right? I want you to think of it that way. And so the mode that I've assigned here for the texture is height. And that's telling it that we want to recognize that relationship between dark and light and the texture being either raised or lowered. And I'm going to change the depth by lowering it. And here I need to give myself some control. So texture each tip has to be on for this. All right, we're not going to get into all the reasons for what that means. Just try this at home. And look at where it says control. I'm going to assign pen pressure. Look what happens to my brush stamp preview down here, okay? My stroke preview. I'm going to turn that off again. Here's what it looks like when nothing's assigned. Now I'm going to control it with pen pressure. Okay, so I'll take the scale of my image. The image that I have is about 300 or 400 pixels square, I believe. It's a tiling pattern that is seamless, and you can create these with plugins. The one I really love is this one right here. It's from Orange Box. It's the FX box, and you can create seamless tiling textures with that. It's wonderful. There are other ways to do it as well, and you can look up tutorials on that. So back to the texture. Now that I've assigned pen pressure, I'm going to make sure that we're at 100% of the size. Not that it matters, but with light pressure, watch what happens. See that? It's picking up that texture because with light pressure, I'm grazing the surface or the dark areas, the black areas and the very deep dark gray areas, right? As I use more pressure, I get into those grooves, and as I use less pressure, I just touch the surface. So I hope that's making sense. I'm going to zoom in a bit so you can really see what's happening here. Light pressure, darker pressure, heavier pressure, excuse me, and then light pressure. So you want to build some kind of a pencil-y kind of a brush. Well, look, here you are. You're off to the races, right? Great way to start. If I were using a canvas texture and a brush that was more painterly, I would apply this. There's a lot more you can do with texture, but I want you to notice that this is the most, I think, useful for most digital artists, is to have the texture be working in such a way that you control with pen pressure how much of it is exposed. However, there are other ways to use it. If you use it in a mode for subtract, which I'll show you now, you can actually decide to have that texture be shown through. I turned off texture each tip for this. But look, as I increase that, then every stroke I make is going to show me that texture, no matter how much pressure I'm using, all right? Zoom in on that. And as I come over it, over and over and over and over, eventually I get to a point where very little of it shows through. Okay, but that's after many, many passes, okay? So that's another useful mode for some people to use texture. It's good for watercolor brushes where you are trying to emulate watercolor in Photoshop and you want there to be a texture that's always visible to a degree. But there are also good ways to use that for painting with a pattern. And an example of that would be halftone brushes, where you just want to have a blanket an image with a very solid halftone. However, the halftone brushes that I designed that are responsive to pen pressure, for example, I believe I put a few of them in the spring 2019. Here we go. Here's one. This will react to pen pressure to reveal more or less of that halftone pattern. Same here. Okay, and that is just taking advantage, what we already looked at, of, under texture, the height settings tied to pen pressure. All right, so more for you to noodle around with there. Okay, so it's 1 o'clock, and it's time for me to move on to some more advanced stuff. Look up some of these other things for yourselves to get in, but I wanted to expose the basics of how to control these things. Now I want to skip ahead and go to some really cool features about brushes that you might not be aware of. First things first, if you have a Photoshop CC plan of some kind, any kind of Creative Cloud plan where you've got Photoshop, come over here to the top right corner of your brush settings panel, brushes panel, pardon me, right here, and you'll notice there's an option to get more brushes. When you tap on that, it's going to take you to the login page, okay, right here. If you sign in with your Adobe ID, you will get to a page where there are over 1,800 brushes for you to download and play with. And I promise you these will take care of whatever it is you need. Some of them are already loaded here, and I want to show them to you today. And the reason I've loaded the Mega Pack, which is right here, is because it has so many different categories of brushes we can talk about that expose some of these little known ways to use brushes in Photoshop. And I want to start with a category unto itself, mixer brushes, that a lot of people have never played with. Now, if you look over here at my brushes, if I long tap on that, you'll see I have the brush tool, but at the bottom I also have this brush, the mixer brush tool. Now, what are mixer brushes? Well, in the Mega Pack, I'm going to open up the Real Oils category, okay? And I'm going to show you a couple of things about mixer brushes. I'm going to start with one of my favorites, which is the Goody. All right, now, I'll just grab a color, and I'm going to paint with this brush. Notice right away that there is a texture associated with it, and that's a canvas texture, right? Now, we know how that's happening because we've just covered this. Sure enough, if I go to my texture, I see that height is right there. Only in this case, pen tilt is controlling it. Now, we didn't talk about pen tilt, but if I just hold my stylus up here for you to see, imagine this is the surface I'm drawing on. If it's perpendicular, I'm using the stylus at a perpendicular angle, then that is normal tilt. But as I tilt away from vertical, all right, so I'm moving from a 90-degree angle to like a 60 or a 45, I can actually have the angle at which I'm holding the stylus control different aspects of the brush, all right? You can actually use it to control the size of the brush. When we talked about size jitter, you can do it for scatter. You can even do it for texture. Now, here, I'm exposing a lot of the texture. The reason for that is I'm actually drawing at a very steep angle like this. Okay, I hope it's clear what I'm showing you here. So I hold the pen up, and if I were to lay it down flat, okay, so it were horizontal with the surface, and then pick it up just slightly, and essentially like you're shading with a pencil on the side of the pencil, that's what I'm doing with my stylus right now. And that is how I'm exposing all that texture. So that's a neat thing. But the reason I wanted to show you this brush is because it is in the mixer brush category. When you open mixer brushes, you'll notice something. The bar up here at the top of the screen, right, which is the properties bar for the tool that you're using, is going to show you different options than what you normally have for a standard Photoshop brush. And over here we have different options for the kind of brush that you're using in terms of the way it works with paint. Right, I have dry, heavy load as the option right now, but you can play around with these and you'll notice that what it's going to do is control the settings here for wetness, the load of the paint, and how much it mixes. Watch what happens when I grab another color and paint with this brush. Well, that's not something you see every day with regular Photoshop brushes. If you can tell, the paint is actually mixing with what's already there on the surface. Okay, so I'll put some yellow over here. Maybe I'll grab this darker color here, and as I push it into the yellow, look what happens. All right, so it's mixing with that paint. So mixer brushes do allow you to do naturalistic paint mixing effects in Photoshop. But there's another very little known secret about mixer brushes that's pretty amazing, and that's what I want to talk about today. A lot of folks know, yes, okay, I can mix paint with mixer brushes, and that's all well and good, all right? But there's another cool thing you can do. And to do this, I'm actually going to use a different brush because it really shows it off beautifully, and that's the cake brush. Come over here to the cake brush. All right, now, put some color down. All right, no big whoop. When I paint over it, you'll notice it's not mixing at all. The cake brush by default does not have any mixing because if you notice the mixing value is set to 0, and the wetness value is also set to 0, okay? But here's the interesting thing. I'm going to zoom in for a moment. Here is an area that has some yellow, And it has a few pixels there where the canvas is showing through, where the black paint is still visible. Now, if you've ever used Photoshop to paint and draw, you know that you can use the shortcut of your Option key to sample color from your document at any time. Well, look over here. We have our own color swatch for mixer brushes, separate from the color swatch that you use with your color picker. And if I tap on this little arrow here, I have options, one of which is Load Solid Colors Only. Well, that is how you would normally expect any brush to work in Photoshop, by simply holding down my Option key and tapping on the canvas. Look what happens. I'm going to select orange because that's the color I happen to be hovering over at that moment. But watch this. I'm going to turn that off. Now I'm going to come back over here, hold down my Option key, and just tap right there. Now look at the color swatch. Completely weird, right? What did it do? Well, it actually selected, pixels in the same dimensions as the brush. So if it's a 200 pixel diameter brush, it's going to sample 200 pixels, all right, of space on the canvas. But whatever is on the canvas, it's going to sample it all at once. So what happens the next time I paint a stroke? Look, see that? It's painting with all those colors at once. So holy cow, this opens up a whole world of possibilities for people who like to do naturalistic oil painting and other effects in Photoshop. So let's say, for example, I want to paint with a sort of a reddish orange color, but I don't want the paint to look so flat, right? Well, look, I'll just take another color that's close by, an analogous color, and I'll graze over the surface a little bit here and there. And then I'll take another color that's similar to that color and a little darker. Okay, so I'll come down this way and just make a few strokes here and there like that. Now, if I sample this area, I've got all those colors mixed together, and look what happens as I paint. So now I can see every brush stroke that I put down, one after the other, because I'm painting with multiple colors at once. Now you can do this with any mixer brush, and you can sample literally anything from the canvas, all right? So, as a weird example of how this would be fun, pull up my brushes here for a moment. And I'm going to go to the effects box here. Oh, sorry, not the effects box. My mistake. Come back to the real oils. Oh, you know what? It's in the concept art set, which I don't have loaded. That's what we need. Well, hang on a second. Let's go ahead and load those brushes. We'll go like this. We'll go import brushes. Come over to Dropbox. We'll go to brush sets. There we go. Concept brushes. Here we go. Bear with me, folks. I want to show you how this could be useful for y'all. So just chit-chat in the chat while I do this. Or if you want, tell each other some dad jokes, because usually from my other drawing show I do the dad joke thing. And I don't have any good ones for you today. All right, here we go. All right, now, concept brushes. Here's what I wanted to show you. Look right here. This is a brush that has a very unique stamp. And that stamp is the shape of a few leaves, right? But look at my color swatch. I know it's really tiny, but you'll notice there are a bunch of different colors in there. Watch what happens when I paint with this brush. Look at that. Beautiful. So this is a fall leaves brush. Now, what's amazing about this is I'm using this one stamp, right? But because of what we talked about earlier with all of the settings that you can adjust, right? Shape dynamics and scattering and things like that, I'm able to make really different stamps, and I'm taking advantage of multiple colors at once because of that multicolor swatch that you can create with a mixer brush. And then you get effects like this. So really, there's just so much you could do to play with this and make weird stuff. The example I always like to give is a fun one, is I just take the basic round brush in Photoshop. We go to General Brushes, and we're just gonna go to our brush tool. Here's that hard round brush. All right, now, I'm gonna paint a blue circle. Very exciting, right? And hang on, I'll do another one. There we go. All right. And I'm gonna lock the layer transparency right down here so I can paint inside of it, right? Take that soft round brush and just shade that a little bit. And then I'm gonna make a little highlight up here in the corner. All right, nothing too fancy, but there's this sort of a sphere that I've painted, right? Now if I go back to my mixer brush for a moment, all right, now it's this crazy brush, right? Watch this. I am going to go to my brush settings, turn off all the silliness, and I'm gonna make my brush stamp just a basic circle. All right, but remember, I'm working with a mixer brush now. Make this circle big enough to cover this entire circle that I've painted, all right? Now I'm gonna go here and say, I wanna load solid colors only. No, 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 that's off, because if I come over here and hold down my Option key, look what I've done. I've just sampled that billiard ball. Okay, so let me go to a new layer. Still got that on my brush. Let's make sure that our spacing is nice and tight, okay? And watch what happens when I paint with this. How cool is that? I'm creating this tube, which is just, you can't even believe how many things you could do with this. Imagine if you want to paint some kind of metal piping in your painting, right? And you just create that one stamp, or you want to paint some other kind of object that, as long as there's a repetitiveness to it that you can drag and paint, you can do all kinds of really weird, crazy things with this. So I just love to give that example of the possibilities of what you can do with a multicolor stamp and varying your spacing and whatnot. Look what happens if I increase the spacing and then I actually turn on shape dynamics, okay? And we'll do this. All right, so now I could do a series of like little beads or something, right? Completely different. So lots to play with. Mixer brushes are a completely interesting category that needs to be explored more, and I highly encourage you to try them out. All right, another thing I wanted to tell you about that a lot of people don't take advantage of, and it's a really wonderful thing, is color dynamics. And what are color dynamics? Well, let's go back to that example we were using with our basic brush for just a moment, because it's the easiest way to explain what's happening. So I'll go to my general brushes and just use that hard round brush again. So here we are back in familiar territory. We're painting with this. Not too exciting, right? Let me show you something interesting. I'm going to increase the spacing first, okay, so we can see this very clearly. Now, normal brush is going to paint with one solid color. We know now that mixer brushes can use multicolor stamps, which is also very interesting. But let's talk about color dynamics. I'll turn that on for a moment. Now, to start with, I want to ignore this control for pen pressure. I'm going to turn that off because I just want to show you the basics of color dynamics first. We have sliders for hue, saturation, and brightness, okay? People call them HSB sliders. Some people say HSV for hue, saturation, and value, right? Look at the hue jitter. Now, this means that I'm going to apply a jitter in the same way we did with size jitter or scattering, right? To the hue, which is the color I'm using. So let's say I grab a nice orange, all right? And the hue jitter is set to 0. Nothing's happening right now. Well, this is what I'm going to get when I paint, right? You know, I have increased spacing, which is why I'm getting this dotty look. There's a reason for that, because I want you to see what happens with hue jitter. I'm going to increase the hue jitter to 20%. Now watch. What is happening? We are telling Photoshop that if you were to look at a color wheel, right, whichever place I drop my color picker onto, whatever that color is, I want you to have a range along the color wheel in either direction, okay, either to the right or to the left, of 20% of the total circle of color, right? So you have that circle for the color wheel, and that's going to go from whatever color you land on around the rainbow and back to that same color, right? But in this case, we're just giving it a range of 20%, which means you're going to get analogous colors all the way through. Well, this is very, very powerful, not just for a silly decorative party streamer that you want to make like this, because if you want to think about this in painterly terms, there's a lot more you can do with it. Let's just, for a moment, though, look at what else we have here. We have a saturation jitter. So this is going to tell you that the color is either going to be bright and saturated, or it's going to be more dull. Okay. Look what happens if I increase that to a really, really high number. We're getting some colors that are, if I were to just select that on the color wheel and look on the color picker, this is pretty desaturated when compared with this, right? So we're increasing that range right there. What else do we have? We also have brightness jitter. Let's bump that up. Now look. Very interesting, right? And a combination of all of these is going to give me a pretty crazy range of colors. All right, so why is this useful for painters? I'll show you why. Let's go into the Mega Pack again. I'm going to go to a paint box brush called Gooey. There we go. Here it is. So the Gooey brush takes advantage of color dynamics and scattering and brush spacing in an interesting way so that when you paint with it, what you get is the look of a sort of impasto kind of application of the paint, like thick paint. All right, now let me use a slightly lighter color so you can really see this coming through. There. I'm just going to kind of scrub on the canvas with this so you can see this. Zoom in a bit. So you see what's happening here. Every time I paint, right, the strokes that I'm making, you can actually see them layering on top of one another, which is not normal for Photoshop brush behavior. Normally you just get flat color and that's what you get. But what we're doing here is, if I expose the color dynamic settings, we have a hue jitter of only 1%, but we have a brightness jitter of 6. Now that's just enough that the stamp I'm using, if we look at this brush tip shape, let me just increase the spacing here. There's the stamp that's being exposed, okay? The stamp that I'm using, and you can see it as I'm painting too, this stamp is being applied with a slightly different brightness and a slightly different hue with every single time it's being deposited on the canvas, right? But because it's subtle, then the effect that you get winds up being, just decrease that spacing again, the effect that you get is a nice kind of a thick paint look, right? Really, really lovely. And the other reason this is working is because of scattering. We have 3 counts of that brush stamp being applied all at once, right? Let's use something slightly brighter. Hopefully you can see this. There we go. 3 stamps, right? And they're all being scattered by just 7%. So if they're offset by just a hair here and there, right, it's enough to give us a line that we can still control. I can still paint in the direction I want, left to right, right to left, okay? Paint a circle. But if I come in and look at that, there's all this color variation and lovely brushstroke action in there, okay? I've also used transfer. Now, transfer is where you can control the opacity or flow with pen pressure, pen tilt, whatever you like, right? So if I set that range really high, let's say that I want to have pen pressure to control the opacity all the way down to 0, right? Now watch what happens when I use light pressure. There's almost nothing, and as I build up, I can get to a full stroke there, full opacity, right? So I had that set somewhere around 60, I can't remember. I can always reset the brush by simply tapping on it. Yeah, 69, 20, and 0. So, look at that. I do have some control. Now, if I use slightly less pressure, what I'm able to do is get less of that color dynamics effect coming through. And that's because I'm using the colors that are there, and I'm drawing on top of what's there, and it's just blending the two together, and you're not going to see as much of a sharp contrast, okay? But that's one good way that you can use this in a painterly kind of way. But I want to show you a step you could take further, which is really cool, and that's to use, under color dynamics, that's to use foreground and background jitter. Now, Foreground and background colors have been in Photoshop for many, 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 many years. And people use them for different reasons, but painters use them in a really specific way that I think is fascinating, and that is this. I can actually paint with both colors at the same time using foreground and background jitter. And I can say, look, I want pen pressure to control this. So let's say I want to paint a sort of a violet color. Well, I would first have a reddish color on my brush, okay? And then what makes violet? Red plus blue. So I'll go ahead and grab a blue color as well. There, now I've got a red and a blue. Now, because I have pen pressure set to control the foreground background jitter, what that means is heavier pressure is going to apply more of the foreground color, while lighter pressure will apply more of the background color. And so if I use a medium amount of pressure, I'm going to basically get a color that's kind of in between the two. So watch this. This is me painting with medium pressure now, using those two colors. This is me painting with heavy pressure. This is me painting with very light pressure, okay? Now, why am I getting more of a violet color with light pressure? The reason is because of transfer. Because I already have it set so that with light pressure, I'm going to get very little flow. We see 20% here. And opacity has already been reduced, right, by a little over 30%. Well, I have to use slightly more pressure to get a mark at all, which means I'm going to bring some of that red in. If you don't want that, you simply turn off transfer altogether, right? So now my brush settings have no transfer effects, which means no opacity jitter, no flow jitter. So heavy pressure gives me red. Light pressure gives me blue. Actually, I'll turn off shape dynamics because I have to make sure that I can see the mark. There we go. All right, now, heavy pressure, light pressure, heavy pressure, light pressure. Look how crazy this is, and everything in between. This is me, here, let me just, for a moment, paint so that you can see what happens if I just use varying pressure along the way as I go. Very weird, right? So for painterly effects, there's just so much you can do with this. Now, one example is, just quickly show you, I'm going to open up the Spring 2020 brushes and go to the mushy brush. The mushy brush is a kind of a watercolor wash kind of a brush. And I want you to see that it has applied to it with color dynamics, pen pressure controlling the foreground and background jitter. But it also has wet edges. What are wet edges? Well, wet edges allow you to create this effect that you've seen with watercolors when they dry. Sometimes the edge of the shape you paint is slightly darker, kind of has like an outline around it. That's what happens with this brush. So watch, the combination of the texture, the wet edges, and the color dynamics allows me to do things like this. I can paint heavy with the red, lighter with the blue, all in the same stroke, and I'm still getting this wet edge effect. So this is amazing for naturalistic painting, because if I want to just paint one stroke next to another, right, I can do that. Now, why is it getting darker here? Well, look, brush modes are entering into our equation. And just like you have layer blending modes over here, you also can do the same thing with brushes. And because this is set to multiply, every successive stroke is going to darken the color of what's already there. It's going to multiply with that color. I can always change these. I can go to normal, right? And so now it's not going to be as dark when I paint over it. But here's the crazy thing I want everybody to know about Photoshop brushes. Any brush, except for mixer brushes, but any brush can be an eraser by setting the brush mode to clear. So look, let's say I have this Splish Splash brush, okay? This is in the Spring 2020 set. Really fun to paint with, okay? I'm gonna do some splishy, splashy stuff on the page, right? And I say, okay, now I wanna erase with that brush, but I don't have an eraser like that. Don't worry, come over here and go to Clear under your mode, and look, Instant Eraser. And no, I'm not painting with white. I am clearing away pixels from the canvas using all the properties of that brush. So any brush, thousands of brushes, can instantly be made into an eraser by simply changing the brush mode to clear. So gang, Thanks for hanging out. I know it's a lot of territory I covered. I hope I exposed some cool, interesting things you've never seen before, and I hope you'll try these out. I'll do more of this. I'm going to have a masterclass in illustration starting very soon here at Adobe Live, and I hope you'll join me for those classes. I'll keep you informed about that on my Twitter feed, and hopefully we'll make an announcement as well. Anyway, thanks everyone. I hope to see you again soon, and take care. Enjoy the weekend. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy, take care of each other, and above all, remember to be kind. I'll see you next time.